Greetings, friends of liberty. Not a week ago, Marguerite and I attended a dinner party at Lord Willoughby's residence. I've been thinking during the day about the marvellous variety of dwellings to be found throughout our British Isles, from the lowliest peasant cottage with its thatched roof to the most ornate mansions on Stratford Place with their slate shingles. And then, as pure chance would have it, I struck up a conversation with a John Marshall, industrialist extraordinaire, at all of 28 years, from Leeds in Yorkshire. Sir John, as he told me, now that he is the controlling partner, has in the last few years begun an ambitious project of constructing what will eventually be a huge flax spinning factory, employing thousands of workers, operating thousands of steam and water-driven spindles. But since all these thousands need dwellings, it appears that he himself, with his naturally perceptive English mind, has originated, or else copied from local builders, an entirely new form, called back-to-back housing. Here, houses are constructed with a common wall, either on both sides, left and right, or on the back, or all three. They also feature a common backyard, courtyard. All this allows for a cheaper construction, while not significantly compromising quality. Now, if we turn to the issue of quality, low-cost housing, or its absence in your own 20th and 21st centuries in America, we find today the detailed, comprehensive, yet highly readable The Excluded Americans, Homelessness and Housing Policies by William Tucker. Tucker, a research fellow and member of the Independent Institute, a libertarian think tank, here gives in one single source a thorough explanation for precisely how America's housing policies have led in many cities to a decrease in available housing and thus a huge increase in homelessness. Tucker begins in the tried and true tradition of on-the-ground investigative reporting. At age 44, I admit I'm getting a little old for adventures. It has been a long time since I hopped a freight or hitched a ride. Still, to write about anything, you have to be there. So one night, late in February, after everyone was asleep, when the television news announced the temperature would be dropping to near zero, I suddenly realized this might be my last chance to spend a night in Grand Central Station. And so off he went. What did he encounter? Human wreckage, mostly the old, the spent, the disturbed. Some talk to themselves, others sip wine or lie scratching their bloated bodies. At least 4 times during the night, a well-dressed, late-night traveler burst through the outer doors, strode confidently down the walkway, and recoiled in horror as he found himself facing a locked gate and a floor filled with homeless people. Each turned and fled. He concludes this little vignette by saying, "I got on the subway and headed home, a nice warm bed waiting for me. But for these, with whom I had spent the night, there would be many more cold nights ahead." What has caused so many people to live outside in the dead of winter and heat of summer, with no place to call their own in the land of the free and home of the brave? One reason often given is the personal pathology explanation. As Tucker explains it, some people suffer such severe personal disabilities that they are unable to find housing in any market. These disabilities include mental illness or drug and alcohol dependencies. In addition, emptying the psychiatric hospitals in the 1950s and 60s and beginning the Great Society welfare state, which damaged the black and low-income families, intensified the problem. A second popular cause offered is the incomes theory. Homelessness has been caused by deteriorating incomes
the result of rising unemployment and poverty. Is this true? Not really, since A, there was little homelessness in the 60s when more people were poor, and B, homeless shelters around the country often report that up to 23% of their residents are regularly employed. Regularly employed. A third explanation, often advanced, is that it's because of cutbacks in government services. But as Tucker shows with a graph entitled Housing Assistance Payments as a Percentage of Total Budget Outlays, these government benefits actually massively increased from 1960 to 1990, after which they remained the same. Finally, a fourth reason often given is simply the lack of affordable housing. Here we're getting closer to the answer. Why? First, the percent of salary needed for a mortgage has increased from about 15 to 25%. Secondly, the national housing starts since 1970 are down, both for one and multiple unit dwellings. And thirdly, both national homeowner and rental vacancy rates are down to the low end of their 50-year graph, indicating a greater difficulty in finding housing. So then the question becomes, why are some areas of the country, such as the East and West Coast, and their cities, such as San Francisco and New York, experiencing higher prices and lower vacancy rates, and thus homelessness? In order to find the answer, Tucker then turns to the stats for individual cities, allowing us to tease out the individual policies contributing to their homelessness. Using regression analysis, do we find for individual cities a significant direct relationship between unemployment and homelessness? No. How about for poverty? No, not significant. How about the amount of public housing? No. And neither for annual precipitation, weather, and population. Now, if we try regression analysis for rental price, we get a slight correlation. And for vacancy rates, an even larger correlation, accounting for about 15% of the variation between cities, with a 1% decline in the rental vacancy rate associated with a 10% increase in homelessness. And how about rent control? Even stronger, explaining 27% of the variation among cities and on average a 250% increase in homelessness. Indeed, no city with rent control has a vacancy rate over 3%. Finally, how about the price of a home? That turns out to be the most significant variable of all, explaining 42% of the variation in homelessness. So given that, number one, the median price of homes is the best predictor of homelessness, and two, the presence of rent control, the second best indicator, the next step would be to understand why high housing prices and rent control would cause homelessness. Interestingly, while prices in California are now sky high, they didn't used to be that way. In 1972, the median price of a home nationwide was $31,900, while the median price in California was $32,400. So what happened, causing housing prices in California, and specifically San Francisco and Los Angeles, to skyrocket? Well, California started making the development and construction of new homes much more difficult, thus reducing the supply. So, for example, in 1972 in Marin County, residents prevented farmers from selling 2-acre lots. The law was changed to require 60-acre lots. What excuse did they give? The 2-acre lots would upset the local ecological balance. In addition, they won control of the water board and then declared a complete moratorium on new residential water hookups, making new housing construction impossible. As a result of such no-growth sentiment since the early 1970s, builders put up only 2,000 new housing units in San Francisco in 1986, while Dallas, which already had a surplus of housing, got 10,000. Rental vacancies to a minuscule of 1.8%, the lowest in the nation. As Tucker concludes, Herein lies a paradox. While everyone wants affordable housing, nobody wants it in their neighborhood. And what has happened in the San Francisco area has been happening everywhere else. Are there other factors sometimes affecting housing availability? Yes. Remember so-called urban blight in the 60s and 70s? Vast tracts of cities filled with lower-class homes? Well, what were those areas? They were just cheap, affordable housing for poor people on a vast scale. So what did liberals then do? They completely razed many of those areas, then replacing them with either expensive condos or garbage public housing. In addition, cities everywhere started preventing much cheaper prefabricated or mobile homes to be used. Mitt Romney's father, George, as head of the Department of Housing and Urban Development, actually tried to get the prefabricated housing industry off the ground, but failed miserably. Tucker next introduces one of the key explanatory concepts of the whole book, filtering. He points out, contrary to what one might imagine, that in some slum areas, Harlem for example, people visiting for the first time are always stunned by the beauty of the buildings. Expecting to find a slum, they are instead confronted with street after street of magnificent old brownstones with solid foundations, sturdy facades, and exquisite details. As far as potential is concerned, the houses of Harlem are among the most beautiful ever built in America. Just like a car market where the richest people buy the new car and the poorest the car when it's on its last legs, so too the housing market filters dwellings down from the richest to the poorest over time. It starts with mansions and ends with those large mansion rooms being subdivided into dozens of cubicles for an overnight hotel for the poor. As Tucker says, the best strategy for improving the overall housing stock is to build new housing and let it circulate. Now, another key question would be to ask, how do communities and municipalities prevent people who want to build new houses and homes from doing just that? How can they thus manipulate the whole local housing market? By, of course, exclusionary zoning. The reality is America didn't used to have any zoning at all as we know it today. And how did no zoning work out? Very well. In fact, with developers and builders customizing everything from deeds to covenants to lot size. As long as they respected surrounding deed restrictions, they could do whatever they wanted in any location. But in 1916, New York City invented the nation's first zoning law. And by the 1920s, other municipalities started using these zoning laws to prevent lower income dwellings from being built. Then, fatefully, in the 1926 Supreme Court decision, Ambler Realty v. Euclid, the court decided, probably unconstitutionally, that the practice of zoning, as for example by labeling one area residential and the other commercial, was legal, allegedly justified, and based on the police power of the cities to regulate so-called nuisances under nuisance law. The problem was nuisance law already dealt with individual cases of nuisance, as did previous deeds and contracts. So this decision just enables cities to collectively violate the rights of builders to build and homeowners to customize their dwellings. And what has been the effect of the Supreme Court legalizing this violation of property rights? Catastrophic. What gets built, where it gets built, how much it's going to cost, all this is now basically determined at the local level. As these regulations have become more burdensome, housing has become more scarce and expensive. So, for example, A, suburban residents in single-family districts are extremely sensitive to the idea of living in rental districts, which is probably the major reason that the suburbs have never been able to provide the variety of housing that city neighborhoods do. B, in 1983, the Supremes decided yet another important case called Mount Laurel II. In it, they essentially mandated that cities and towns set aside some zoning areas for low-income housing, but otherwise could continue their exclusionary zoning. But many cities gave this low-income housing to young professionals or to the relatives of their officials instead of to poor people. C. Towns charge newcomers what are ironically called welcome stranger assessments, which exorbitantly tax newcomers for all the services they will use. Or they charge them impact fees. This gradually shifted the tax burden from established residents to newcomers in the community. By preventing growth, existing homeowners could increase the value of their home while avoiding paying for extending roadway, sewer systems, fire and police services, or schools. D. As a result of exclusionary zoning, with no industry or other high-value institutions to pay the majority of taxes, and thus reduce residential tax rates, residents started shifting the burden of taxation elsewhere. So, for example, New Jersey imposed the state income tax and lowered the local share of the education burden from 60% to 25%. Other states made similar changes. Or cities would simply lower the residential property tax to half that of commercial property. E. Is there still an example of how America used to be? Yes, Houston, Texas, where there is no zoning and housing prices are a small fraction, sometimes 1/4 to 1/5 of those often found in California for the same dwelling. No zoning there works out fine with plenty of housing and relatively low homelessness. But the biggest single cause of homelessness is rent control, and it is to this that our author now turns, using Berkeley and Santa Monica as illustrations. He notes, A, given the huge influx of college students every year attending UCLA, and given that in 1971 the Supreme Court allowed students to vote in their town of college residence, the students were thus given carte blanche to pass rent control legislation, which they did. B, the result of the artificially low rents was both to increase the demand for housing and reduce supply, as all rent control legislation does. So, for example, in Santa Monica, new housing starts went from an average of 625 annually in 1978 and 79 to 31 annually by 1983-84. As a result, in one 5-year period, the number of private dwelling units in Berkeley occupied by University of California students declined from 9,700 to 6,700 units. D. The irony is that while Berkeley considers itself progressive, it's usually the white college yuppie kids who milk the system and hardworking Asian, immigrant, or black landlords who get the shaft. E. As a result, one landlord couple, the Levesques, lost their $30,000 life savings. Joseph Levesque suffered a nervous breakdown. 3 months later, he broke into a motel and raped an anonymous woman. F. In one case in Oakland, a neighbor, Mr. Kelly, threw Molotov cocktails into the crime-ridden homeless encampment that the backyard of a rent-controlled building had become. The neighborhood overwhelmingly supported his actions. His statement at the time? The next thing is going to be dead bodies. Now let's turn to the most egregious municipal case of rent control in America, New York City. As Tucker says, there is a quality to New York's housing problems that goes beyond what has already been presented. A. Contrary to rent control advocates, who imagine that most landlords are Mr. Moneybags, landlords are generally of the same social class as their tenants. In fact, one survey of 700 New York landlords found that 49% had only a high school education. Many have worked in the building trades and specifically became landlords because they knew they could do the maintenance on their buildings themselves, saving money. B. New York City now treats landlords so badly that landlords try to convert their apartments to condominiums. This has been outlawed. Or landlords try to find a rich person to sell the building to who will occupy the whole building himself. Or landlords actually try to tear the building down, which is also sometimes outlawed or only allowed after the landlord has paid the tenants relocation fees of thousands of dollars. Or landlords end up asking huge amounts of money up front from new tenants called key money, which is technically illegal but impossible to police. In addition, number one, tenants themselves often then sublet the apartment to others, making large profits that the landlord should have gotten. Number two, given that these horrendous conditions, most landlords invariably let the building deteriorate. Renters then use this fact as an excuse, citing building code violations for not paying their rent. Or in some cases, tenants break things to create fake violations. Number three, a kind of natural selection sets in, with bad landlords driving out the good. In addition, tenants become bad as well and more indifferent to other tenants making noise or causing other disruptions, since they know now they can't be evicted. Number four, since the rent board is almost always loaded with activists, the whole process of dispute resolution soon becomes a kangaroo court. Number five, as Google says, the city of New York owns or leases over 17,000 properties, covering about 43,000 acres across 5 boroughs, which is an area roughly the size of Brooklyn. In some cases, the New York City Department of Housing Preservation and Development, HPD, which controls much of the housing in Harlem, take homeless people and drug addicts out of homeless shelters and put them into a landlord's apartments without his permission. Number six, as in Berkeley, since no serious developer wants to risk building, what the rotten apple does is to try to lure developers with the promise of subsidies and tax exemptions. But what invariably happens then is that those new tenants in those new buildings eventually discover how much more they're paying than tenants in rent-controlled apartments and take the landlord to court, at which point he loses. As Tucker says, the word city officials use to describe this process is recapture, a term with a distinctly Orwellian flavor. As a result, New York City builds only a trickle of about 12,000 new units a year, but Dallas, with 1/7 the population and 15% vacancy rates, puts up the same amount. Number seven, as often happens in society, the smartest, most educated, and richest know or learn how to game the system the best, with examples like Judge Dankberg, appointed to the New York City Housing Court in 1980, getting his own rent-controlled apartment at $75 a month. Or there was Mayor Koch, who had a rent-controlled apartment on Washington Street in Greenwich Village, paying $441 a month for a large one-bedroom apartment with an outer terrace. Or there was television personality Alastair Cook with a rent-controlled apartment on Fifth Avenue overlooking Central Park. For 8 rooms, Cook paid $1,357. Number 8. Vacancy rates in Moscow on the Hudson were at 1.4% in 2023, a record low since 1968, meaning that unless you're willing to hire a mafia hitman or wait a couple of decades, you'll never get an apartment. As writer John Ezra, who had significant heart problems, said, when he finally got an apartment on the 6th floor, death is a small price to pay for an apartment in New York. Not surprisingly, one estimate of New York City homelessness puts it at 350,000 in 2024. As Tucker says, 80 years of rent control in New York have produced something that is impossible in a free market: homeless people and people-less homes. In conclusion, although I've only touched in passing on many of the topics that Tucker describes here, by now you can understand how government has largely created the homelessness crisis in America. I fell in love with this book, given how knowledgeable Tucker is, how methodically he explains the housing market and its problems, and 4, how often he exhibits his excellent sense of humor. I'd give him an A. Happy for my part that here in 18th century England, I've come to know industrialist John Marshall, and of his magnificent development of back-to-back housing for his workers, I bid you well and remain the Scarlet Pimpernel.